to engage with technology and use that as leverage for changing how people raise money for all types of creative projects. That's probably the path. That's probably the way to have a much greater impact than I can have just as an individual producer. And that's really where I mark the beginning of my path to what has become Artizen.
You're listening to Lights, Camera, Crypto, the podcast exploring all things entertainment and Web3. I'm your host, Stephen Ladden, and this week our guest is Artizen co-founder René Pinnell. In this episode, René details how growing up in an artistic household helped him realize the sacrifice artists face when trying to fund their work, which helped him fuel his desire to create Artizen as a means to help fund human creativity. He's done so with well-known talent like Darren Aronofsky, the Wu-Tang Clan, and Cate Blanchett. René also exposes a more existential topic pertaining to Web3, expressing the idea that tech and art might be one and the same. Let's dive in. René, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve.
Really excited to learn more about you and the work that Artizen does and how all that came to be. I know you've worked with projects from the Wu-Tang Clan to Terrence Malick to Darren Aronofsky. Was the vision to always be immersed in art? What were your early aspirations that kind of put you on this path to where you are today?
I'm a fifth generation artist.
Okay.
Everybody in my family is a painter, a dancer, a filmmaker, a creator of one kind or another, going back to my great-great-great-grandfather. So I've been really steeped in the arts, grew up in them, seeing the beauty and joy that art can bring into people's lives. But I also saw how challenging it is financially to be an artist. Almost everybody I knew in my family struggled with money, and our extended community of artists, like even successful ones, struggled to raise money for their work. And that always seemed unfair in a deep sense, because art brings so much value to the world. And I'd see my other friends who grew up with doctors and lawyers as parents, and I always thought that my family was bringing just as much value to our community and to the world at large, and that there must be better ways to have artists pay their bills and to fund their work. And so that was just like ingrained at a deep level. And then I went to film school to be a filmmaker myself, and I was a filmmaker for 15 years. That was my first love. And I naturally gravitated towards producing and specifically helping people raise money for their movies, because that was the hair on fire problem everyone had. And it was the thing that nobody really wanted to do. So it was what I would jump in more often than not to help with. And this was up until about 2006, 2007, when I got introduced to the world of tech and startups. A company funded a TV pilot. I produced a TV pilot for MTV, and then this tech startup purchased it when MTV passed on the season. And it opened my eyes to this whole other part of the economy and this whole other world of creators. And in the startup world, how people would raise money for startups was so different than how people would raise money for movies. This is much more transparent. Lots of supportive infrastructure for having founders meet with angel investors, accelerators that would help get startups ready for larger investment, and then of course the whole VC industry. It was just all felt like it was built for breaking down walls between founders with an idea and the capital they needed to pull off their idea. And that was very different from the art world, very different than the filmmaking world, which everything feels like it happens behind closed doors,
Sure.
very non-obvious for how to get money. And so that was like the first light bulb that I was like, oh, okay, so there's other ways of doing it. Not every creative project needs to go through the same struggles. And not that startups are easy to raise money for. It's just it's at least an order of magnitude easier than raising money for a movie or for an art project. And it also felt very much like tech had taken the cultural momentum that used to be film. I think for most of the 20th century, film and music were like the dominant forms for shifting culture and pushing culture forward. And I think really in the early aughts, certainly over the last 20, 30 years, tech has replaced art as the main cultural driver. And so those kind of all coalesced, yeah, about 10, 15 years ago for me, and thinking that, oh, okay, if I really want to have a big impact, if I really want to help all of my friends and family and the industry in general, if I really want to make a big impact for helping artists raise capital, tech is probably the way to do it. I have to engage with technology and use that as leverage for changing how people raise money for all types of creative projects. That's probably the path. That's probably the way to have a much greater impact than I can have just as an individual producer.
Sure.
And that's really where I mark the beginning of my path to what has become Artizen, which is the last 10, 15 years has been really spent figuring out how do I use tech to help creators raise money. And I've tried a million different things, and Artizen is the latest and I think the most successful version of the same project essentially I've been working on.
And the project you're working on basically, as you're saying, is you, with your filmmaking and producing background, has been how do you help artists achieve their goals? And it sounds so tech was the answer to that. How does it all work with Artisan, and how do you help further these, in some cases, certainly very high profile projects for different artists? How does it all come together?
Yeah, so what is Artisan to begin with? The way I think of Artisan is we're a community fund for art, science, technology, and design. And what do I mean when I say a community fund? At its base, it means that we pool our money as a community, and that means everything from individuals to our corporate sponsors. We pool our capital into one big bucket, and then we collectively decide how to allocate that capital, which projects ought to receive that money. And we do it as a community. We curate the projects that receive funding from us as a community. And I think that that's really the beating heart of Artisan, is this idea of making it as easy as possible for a group of people to pool their money and then make high quality decisions around which projects are most deserving of that funding. So a lot to unpack and a lot of interesting elements for how Artisan works and the mechanics of it. But at a very fundamental level, I always think of it as community funded and community curated projects.
And how did you land on Artisan? Like, what gave you the confidence based on the previous steps or toes dipped in the arena of using tech to help finance art? Like, how did Artisan become glaringly the move? How
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. How did I decide that this was the thing to invest all of my time and energy into?
yeah.
So it came organically out of my last company. So my co-founder Ruben and I ran a company called Kaleidoscope, and we started it in 2014, and it was when VR and AR were having a resurgence. And for me, I was really excited about it as an artistic medium to tell stories, to go beyond just video gaming, which at the time was the framework that everyone was thinking of VR primarily through. But I saw it as a brand new creative medium that artists and storytellers of all kind would use. And the thing that was exciting about that, beyond just it as an interesting creative medium, was that whenever there's a big platform shift, it shakes the board and you can change the rules of how the game is played. And so for me, I started Kaleidoscope without any clear mission other than let's just start funding projects in this space, as
Mm.
many creative projects as we can. And eventually, hopefully, we will stumble on some insight that we can use to scale beyond just VR and AR. But if we can prove a new model in this new industry, it might be easier than doing in an existing medium because it's a new industry. It's open to new ways of doing business. And we settled on what essentially was an accelerator where we would produce 10 to 20 projects a year, and we'd have creators submit their work internally, so not as a community but internally. We would pick the projects we thought were most interesting and compelling, and then we'd host these private events where Facebook and Google and the public broadcasters in Canada and France and Luxembourg and other countries that do public funding, basically everybody that was funding VR and AR would show up and they'd see these projects pitch, and the ones that received funding we'd produce and see across the finish line. But we only had bandwidth to do 10 or 20 projects a year, partly because they were large budget, at least for VR and AR. They were like a couple $100,000 to a couple $1 million was the scale that we'd work at. But we had all of these talented creators in our community that we just didn't have the bandwidth to engage with. And so what we did in 2017, 2018 is we started an internal grant program where we would award relatively small grants, like $5,000 to $10,000 grants every month or two. And this was not the big idea. This was not like a thing that we thought would become a thing. It was just a sort of a top of funnel way to discover new talent and to support the thousands of creators that had formed around our company. But it took off in a way that we didn't expect. We had hundreds of really high quality projects being submitted every month. And I realized early on that this was something that our community got a tremendous amount of value out of, but I personally didn't have the bandwidth to sort through all these projects and figure out which ones ought to receive the grant. Like I did that the first couple of months, and it was basically all I did the first couple of months. And it was also just my own opinion. And I knew that I think I've got good taste, but I also have my own taste, and that's just one perspective. And then I was going to miss a lot of really great projects just because it wasn't the stuff that was to my liking, but that there would be a large audience that probably would dig it.
Sure.
And so my co-founder Ruben and I were like, let's hack together something that would allow the community to do this heavy lift of curation. And it was just duct taped together, and it was kind of dog shit for the first couple of iterations. And we just discovered, oh my God, like community curation, wicked hard problem. How do you get a group of people that are often in competition with each other? Because often members of the community would have submitted projects themselves. So how do you have these people that are often competing for the same funding or are fans of one project or another? Like, how do you get them all to come together and to arrive at something that feels like a consensus, and for it to not just devolve into sort of gray, muddy mediocrity, just taking the average? How do you still allow for weird projects to bubble up to the surface, which I think is what like small group curation is really good at, is identifying sort of those diamonds in the rough. And then how do you have it be like a process that like everybody feels is fair at the end of the day? Like really interesting and really challenging problem. And so we just hacked on that for like almost a year without having any expectation that it was going to be anything other than an internal product. And that sort of like over that same year of hacking, we got to a scale of these grants that like we were happy to put in a couple $5,000-$10,000 a month to it, but there was way more projects that we wanted to fund. So we decided to open it up to allowing the community themselves to kick in money. And that all culminated in the summer of 2020 when we had a couple of our grants go viral. We had one that Viola Davis is this amazing Academy Award-winning actress. She started a grant with someone in our community named Sharifa called the Black Realities Grant, which supported Black artists working in immersive media. And it took off. Viola did a couple of tweets and posts on Instagram, and that grant raised tens of thousands of dollars the very first month that it was launched. And for Ruben and I, that was the light bulb moment where we're like, okay, I think this might be the thing. I think this might be the thing that we've been looking for. And so our last company was mostly bootstrapped. So we decided to spin Kaleidoscope down and formed a new company called Artizen. And we had just duct taped together this community grant product. So we burned that down to the ground, rebuilt it from scratch, and launched a standalone product and a standalone company in 2021, February. And the first couple of months, actually it was really just the first month, it did great. It grew to $20,000 in grants being awarded that first month, which is really good from starting from zero, from fresh product.
Yeah.
And those were all recurring too. At the time, this was all built on Web 2 tech. And so it was like, fantastic. What a great foundation. After 1 month, there's $20,000 of recurring donations to these grants. Like, we can build on this. We were really feeling like we had struck a chord that resonated with people. But then, God damn it, Stripe canceled our account. We built everything on top of Stripe. And yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
It was partly our fault and partly their fault. Just their fault is a weird way of saying it. But we had a design flaw that, again, at this point now, and speaking to you in 2023, we've awarded close to $1 million in these small $5,000 to $10,000 grants being like the average award size. We've awarded close to $1 million, and we've gone through close to 100 different award cycles. And at the time when we launched this standalone product in in February. We'd already been doing it for almost 2 years. But even so, it's a really hard problem to get people to pool their money and to do high quality curation. So we had this design flaw where you'd have multiple projects competing, and each project would like hustle to get their fans and their followers to donate to the grant in order to give them voting rights to vote for their project to win the grant. And but that first month we had a grant that we partnered with the Tribeca Film Festival, and they were going to give whichever project won, they were going to give a premiere slot at the festival, which is a really big deal in the film industry.
Sure.
And so like creators were motivated because of the cash, and they were extra motivated because of this meaningful award, and very competitive, very competitive. People really wanted to win it. And they went to the extent of holding like viewing parties where their fans would like on Instagram, they'd have these live feeds where they'd give like live commentary as new people would donate. And it was very exciting. But when the grant was finally awarded, there was a project that won, and they got all the money and they got this premiere slot. And then the other projects that had hustled, they got nothing. They got bupkis, which was in retrospect a design flaw. And so what happened is those projects that didn't win is they called their credit card companies up. Not all of them. We only got 15 chargebacks. But anyways, the fans that had contributed thousands of dollars, about 15 of them called their credit card companies and just said, nope, I didn't make these charges. They were faulty. Give me my money back. And that spike was enough for Stripe to cancel our account. It wasn't even a human in the loop. It was a total like trip in the algorithm. Like we had this blip of chargebacks that crossed some threshold, and they said, you know what, we're just going to cancel your account. And that was such a
No
blow.
heads up.
No heads up, dude. It was 24 hours, like literally to the day, 24 hours after we closed this grant, we got an email from Stripe saying, hey, we're looking into this. 24 hours from that, it was canceled. Nothing we could do about it. Couldn't even talk to a person. One of our investors wasn't like super senior at Stripe. It was like fairly senior at Stripe. They couldn't do anything about it. It was just a complete unilateral canceling of your account. And as a company, when you're building your product on top of a payment processor, like that is your lifeblood. You know,
Sure.
that is the bedrock of your company. And so for us, we looked at that and we're like, okay, in one respect, it's fine. This is only a month in. $20,000 felt really good for the first month, good place to grow from. But the idea of integrating with another payment processor, which there are a handful of other really good, fine payment processors, just go to Stripe. But there's no guarantee that something like this wouldn't happen again. And it just, for us, we'd been thinking about making a shift to Web3. Ideologically, we were like aligned with it. We thought it was the long term, it was the right tech stack. But for us, getting canceled by Stripe was the moment where we're like, okay, never again are we going to build our product where some third party can just cancel us, can just deplatform us, can just kill our business unilaterally.
Right.
And so that was the starting gun for the next year of burning the product down to the ground, rebuilding it from scratch. I went off and raised a couple $1 million while my co-founder re-architected everything for Web3. And then it took us all the way until February of this year to relaunch the fucking product. So it was like 2 years.
Wow.
2 years afterwards, it took us to really complete that loop and have something in the market that we felt like was scalable, was ready to grow. And that kind of brings you up to where we are now, Steve, is we've got a product that on one level is kind of the same thing we've been doing for, Jesus, like 7 years, 6 years, something like that, since 2018, 17. And on the other hand, is very different because it takes advantage of the unique affordances of building in the blockchain space.
It also sounds like too then that the Stripe, call it malfunction, really was a blessing in disguise for Artizen's bigger picture, in that you were able to use that as the grounds to position the company for the future of the internet and hopefully longer term sustainability.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, in our minds back in 2021, our plan was to like gradually migrate, where our home base for the time being would be in Web 2 land, and then we'd slowly find ways to migrate into the Web 3 space. But I think that architecture is fundamentally flawed. I do believe that Web 3 is a fundamental shift in how humans and capital coordinate. And I think the right architecture is to firmly build your product in the Web3 space and then build bridges from the Web2 space into the Web3 space, but have your home base and the core of your product built in Web3. So I think you're right. I think it was a blessing in disguise. Though at the time, it was such a gut punch.
Sure. And how did you have the sort of ability to one, withstand that gut punch, but also have the confidence that, hey, you know what, we're gonna see this process through, and eventually what needs to work out will work out? Or was it really a struggle for a minute before the light started to shine through the trees?
We had conviction by that point. We had been running, by the time we launched Artisan as a standalone product in 2021, we had awarded enough funding in this novel, community curated, community funded manner that we had real conviction that there was something here. So it definitely was not like starting from scratch, and it felt a lot more the I don't know if you're an artist, but in the artistic process, you go through this existential dread. You
Mhm.
look at the existential abyss in front of you, and you question whether or not you'll ever figure out the hook for your song or
Mhm.
the plot line for your movie. Am I smart enough? Am I clever enough
Sure.
to get to the other side? And so in startups, it feels very similar when you're doing product. You wander in the wilderness. And so when we got Stripe canceled us, it didn't feel like we were wandering in the wilderness as much. We
Right.
felt like we had a roadmap. We felt like we knew we needed what we needed to build more or less. And it was much more about adapting it for the unique affordances of Web3, which had a lot of existential dread mixed in with it as well. From the creative perspective, there was still a lot of challenges that we needed to overturn, but it also felt like there was a roadmap, and both Ruben and I had a real fire in our belly after that. Like we had something to prove, and I felt I'm over it now, but I was so mad at the time. I was just infuriated and was hell bent on not allowing Stripe to tank this dream.
And it sounds like too, from what you're saying, that you had enough positive use cases that demonstrated, one, the effectiveness of what you were doing, and two, validated that it was something that people desired and wanted. And so having that there, to your point, is huge because you already know that what you're creating, what you're putting out there is something that people want.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it took longer than we thought. At the time, we thought we'd be down for maybe 6 months, but it turned into, yeah, almost 24 months of rebuilding the product, raising the money, doing a lot of tests on the way, but until we had something that we felt was a real product. And honestly, like it's still an experiment. Like every season, so we award funding on a seasonal basis. So every season, creators submit their projects. Our community votes on those projects. The highest rated projects are curated for our official selection. Those then compete for match funding and cash prizes. And every time we do one of these seasons, we still review the data, talk to our users, figure out what worked well, what didn't, and then make improvements. So I think it'll always be an ongoing experiment because this is the kind of problem that you can spend your life trying to solve. And I'm excited to spend my life trying to solve because it's so important and challenging and complex in really interesting ways.
Yeah, yeah. And the fact that it's right at the heart of the Web3 ethos of that community involvement and having them take a very important role in helping that curation. In terms of that, what's the range of projects that are submitted and that you guys look at, and how does that help inform or not inform the slate for a given season?
Yeah, so right now, our community is mostly the sort of like intersection of tech and art. And that's a byproduct of our last company, which was funding immersive projects, VR, AR, XR, interactive games, stuff that threads that needle of deeply technical and deeply artistic. And so a lot of our work, most of our work that is submitted and has raised money is still in that vein, though we've broadened our focus quite a bit. We see Artisan as a fund for human creativity in the broadest sense: art, science, technology, design, and all the interesting spaces between those disciplines. I don't see much of a distinction between creating a film or doing a scientific research project, or between a dance project and something that looks like a startup. At the end of the day, it's a group of people that come together with an idea for something that doesn't exist in the world. And they need some money and they need some time and they need some talent to pull it off. And so for me, I think the distinctions between disciplines are pretty artificial. And from a funding mechanism standpoint, I think they're irrelevant. And so for me, when we designed Artisan, we really tried to find a system that we could envision working just as well for funding a startup as for funding some bizarre art
Hmm.
project. And we wanted it to be that flexible. And if anyone's listening to this, if you are an artist, a scientist, a coder, if you're a creative person producing any kind of work, Artisan wants to see your project. Artisan wants to fund your work. And we're actively trying to make inroads into those different pretty siloed communities, but it takes
Sure.
time. And
And also from what you're saying too, while they may be siloed communities, I think what you're touching on is really interesting, which is thinking of tech, even blurring the lines between tech and art. Are they that far apart? And it sounds like from everything you just described that perhaps they're just different facets to a larger singular entity.
yeah, 100% agree. Yeah, that is my opinion. I've seen people write code that looks like poetry. And I think the act is the same. I think the creative act to make something new that we haven't seen before, something shocking, something original. I think that challenge and opportunity is the same regardless of what your discipline
Mm.
is.
And you just said it, at the end of the day, you're creating, which if that is the basis for art, if creation in all of its forms is art, then it would certainly fall under the blanket term that we're thinking about it in.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think the idea of an artist is an interesting one in that people didn't used to think of chefs as
Right.
artists, but then it got elevated through like celebrity chefs over the last 30 years, and now it's considered an art form. And whenever you're discussing someone, whatever their profession is, and that person is creative and they're operating at the highest level of their game, you refer to them metaphorically as an artist, but I think they really are an artist. I think anybody, whatever your medium is, you become an artist when you're doing something that's deeply creative and done with craftsmanship.
And I like then that if that's the ideology behind Artisan and the lens with which you're looking through things, art specifically with this sort of broad spectrum, then it stands that potentially you guys can help produce and fund a wide array of influential and impactful projects across many mediums.
That's the ambition. One of the interesting things with how Artisan works is once projects are curated for our official selection each season, the way that they compete for match funding and cash prizes is by selling cultural artifacts from their projects. A cultural artifact in the context of Artisan is an NFT that's sold as an open edition. And the NFT is what you'd expect. It's a media asset, a JPEG, a GIF, a movie file, any media asset that tries to capture the essence of the project, tries to capture the big idea behind the project, tries to document an important milestone. Think about it, Da Vinci's manuscript. It's not the work itself, but it's the documentation and it's the connection that a collector feels to Da Vinci's work through that manuscript that makes it a tremendously valuable cultural artifact. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to sell cultural artifacts from projects that don't exist yet to help raise money for those projects. And so when you buy an artifact from a project you love, you get an interesting form of ownership. It's not the project itself, but it's this interesting byproduct of the project. And our bet is that most projects that we fund aren't going to change the world. But if we fund enough of them over a long enough period of time, some of them will change the world. And the artifacts associated with those projects, we would imagine to appreciate and
Mm.
value. And so that's Artisan's bet because whenever someone buys an artifact, we mint it in triplicate. So the person who purchased it gets a copy, the creator of the project gets a copy, and then the Artisan Community Treasury gets a copy. And so we own a third of all the artifacts that are minted, and we mostly just will hold them, though we do also distribute them to members of our community and people that we want to engage in the curation process because these artifacts are actually what gives people voting power. So back in the first phase of a season when creators submit their work, I said that our community votes. I glossed over how they vote. They vote by owning artifacts. So if you own 10 artifacts, you can cast 10 votes for whichever projects you think are the most interesting. But in terms of a financial stake, that's our long-term bet is that we'll end up creating something that looks like an index fund for human creativity. We fund enough of these projects, some of them are going to hit big, and that's where we believe we'll see the
Sure,
upside.
sure. And is there any other practical use aside from being a cultural artifact For the NFTs, is it, you mentioned it gives you voting power within the community to help create which projects, or to help vote on which projects will hopefully be on ensuing seasons. Are there any other tie-ins that the artifacts themselves provide holders?
Yeah, so there's two main elements. One is the more artifacts you own, the louder your voice is going to be heard in our community. And right now, that looks like voting for projects. But as the product evolves, artifact ownership will be the main way that we track and allocate sort of your decision making power across many different realms other than just curation. And the other thing is gated access. Our community is private. You have to own at least one artifact to join it. And right now, that community is built on Console, which is this beautiful app that some friends made that is aiming to replace things like Discord. And you have to have an artifact to join our Console community. In the future, we want to also do token gating around the project itself. So think of Patreon, where when you support a project on Patreon, you get access to this private space where the creator gets to share updates about themselves and their work that only their patrons get. We're going to do something similar with artifacts. So if you buy an artifact from a particular project, that project page on Artizen will become the hub that the creator uses to build community around the project, and the artifact itself will be the thing that grants you access to that private community that forms around a specific project.
Really cool. So really it's helping community members become more immersed in the community itself.
Yeah, and get a bigger stake in it, both in terms of deciding outcomes as well as a bigger upside if any of these projects end up making a big impact and appreciating in value.
Totally. And in that aspect, what has the success been with some of, as you mentioned, you're positioning Artisan for the long term successes. What about the current portfolio of projects from existing seasons? How has that, what's the reach been like? What's the response been like? What has the community, what's their reaction to the slates been?
Since we relaunched the product as the Web3 version of Artisan in February of this year, we're headed into season 3. Season 1 had about 30 projects in it, and in total, the projects in season 1 raised a little over $30,000, with the distribution being, with the highest ranked project, the one that was the most successful, raised about 10,000, and then it was a sloping curve down from that. Season 2 creators raised $70,000, so it was like a 132% increase in funding. And the top ranked project raised just over $40,000. Second place was like 15, third place was like, I don't know, 10. And then we're going into season 3 now. My expectation is that the projects in season 3 will raise above 100,000. And for us, it's just going to be the same game where every season we are the main metric that we track and judge our success by is how much money have these projects raised in total. And as long as each season it's greater than the last season, we'll know that we're on the right track. I expect that by the end of this year, beginning of next year, that projects will routinely be raising, in terms of like the successful ones that are curated, raising in the tens of thousands of dollars. And I hope by end of next year that will be the successful projects will be raising hundreds of thousands. And then hopefully by the time we have our next bull run, whenever that happens, I expect that projects will be raising in the millions. That's our ambition. And that's really just a pretty narrow scope of our ambition, because if I'm totally honest, like the mark for us is we want Artisan to become the dominant funding mechanism for all human creativity. And that's quite, I blush to think of the ambition, but that's the
Sure.
mark. And we probably won't get there, but I think it's really good to have clarity in what you're aiming for.
And it also gives, again, as we were talking about with the blurred lines between tech and art, and really how those two verticals are really perhaps one and the same. It speaks to that same ideology. If you're trying to be the leader of helping fund human creativity, then creativity, art has the strongest connotation. There is, as we've talked about, there creativity doesn't really have limits, and we put those limits on creativity.
100%. And if we look at like the big problems that we face as a civilization, the big existential threats, climate change, nuclear holocaust, radical forms of AI and bioengineering, toppling civilizations. Those all feel like really solvable problems if we increase the amount of support and funding going towards creativity. Those feel like problems that can be solved through human creativity. And so for me, I feel like it's essential for us to dramatically increase the amount of money that goes to things like art and science. I don't think we fund those things nearly enough. And I think the funding that is allocated toward art, science, technology, I don't think it's efficiently allocated. I think we could do a much better job of making those decisions. And I think we can cut out a tremendous amount of waste in the
Mm.
system. There's many different mechanisms for funding these different things. Technology is funded through startups, it's funded through governments, science is funded through universities, it's funded through foundations. There's a lot of different ways that all these things are funded right now. But I think it's you talk to an artist, you talk to a filmmaker, you talk to a scientific researcher, and you'll find a shocking amount of commonality in the failure modes. Decisions get made behind closed doors, right? Nobody knows really how these decisions are made. They're small group decisions of quote unquote elite experts. Typically, there's a lot of failure modes there where it's more often than not, it's the people who just have connections, who've hung out at the right bar at the right time to meet the right people, which is fine, but it's not a great system for ensuring that the most impactful projects get funded. So you're funding your
Sure.
friends, which is again, it's fine. It's just it's not the most efficient capital allocation. And then if you talk to somebody who raises money for a lab at a university or something, like you land a grant, and at least 50% of that is just going to get eaten up by the university, and sometimes even more. Like I've got a friend who is a curator at a major film festival, and when she lands a sponsor, guess how much money gets eaten up by the parent company, and guess how much she has left to fund her actual program?
Oh, I have no idea.
80%.
Whoa.
80% gets gobbled up by the parent company. They're left with 20%. So if she's going to go try to fund some innovative program, it's insanely
Yeah,
difficult.
yeah, that's on paper it sounds great, but then in practical it's not converting what it aims to and convert on.
Exactly. So a sponsor comes in and they think they're putting $1 million towards funding innovative work, and really 80% of that is going towards salaries of management, and 20% ends up going towards the actual program to support creators.
Wow. On that tip of funding creators and funding science and grants and tech startups, what commonalities have you noticed in movies from your background in filmmaking and producing and understanding all these different fields where fundraising is key? What are some of those commonalities that across the board, even though, as you mentioned previously, that it's different mechanics for each individual industry and raise? What are some of the similarities across the board that all of these different verticals have to contend with aside from the opinions of other people?
In terms of the failure, or like what's some commonalities of successful
I think,
projects?
yeah, both, but I was referring to mostly success. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've raised, it's hard to get the exact number, but it's around 50 million plus that I've raised for creative projects and through my career over the last 20 years. And that's been in a lot of different domains. So I do have a good sense of what seems to always result in a successful project. At the end of the day, I think you need to be able to articulate clearly what you're making and try to use as simple language as possible. So often, whether you're trying to raise money for a startup or a movie, getting it down to a couple of sentences that most people can understand and have a clear idea of is surprisingly challenging. If you're boiling down a script that took you 3 years to write into a 3 sentence thing, it's really hard. It's really hard to boil down why this is important and just the mechanics of what it is that you're
Sure.
making. So do that. I think the other big question that you need to always answer is, what impact do you hope to have with your project? Like, how is this going to transform the world of art or science or technology? I think another really important question is giving people a sense of progress. Like, how far along are you? How quickly are you moving? And then finally, why are you the right person to make this project? What about you makes you uniquely suited to write this novel or to do this scientific research project? Like, what is it about you and your background and your skills and your expertise that makes you the only person in the world that can make this specific project? So those four questions, I think, are the most important to answer. And I think all materials that you generate to try to raise capital stem from those four questions.
Super helpful, I think, to any listener who is embarking on a creative endeavor in any of the fields we mentioned, or perhaps ones that we haven't. But at the base, it's still a creative pursuit. So that's super cool. On that tip, with creative pursuits, is there anything upcoming that you can speak to with Artisan in terms of slates, in terms of upcoming partners? What's on the horizon for you guys?
Yeah. So an important note, we accept projects on a rolling basis. So we're always accepting projects. Whenever you submit, it's just dependent on which season you'll be submitting to. But as soon as one season is curated, applications are open at the very next minute for the following season. There's no wrong time to submit a project for funding to Artisan. We are right now toward the end of June. I'm not sure when this will be published, but we're accepting projects for season 3. An interesting thing of note is we partnered with Protocol Labs for their event called Funding the Commons, which will be at the Sorbonne in Paris. So projects curated for season 3 will be exhibited at the Sorbonne. I think we're going to be doing an event in Korea. We try to do one event every season somewhere to have people meet in the real world, hopefully connect with new collectors, have people discover new creators. Other developments coming up that I'm excited about, we're launching a new form of match funding that I'm excited about. So in the past, we've just had one big bucket of match funding, but now we are allowing our sponsors and our partners to create standalone match funds that are targeted toward funding the type of creators and causes that matter to that organization. For instance, in the past, we had Microsoft as one of our sponsors, and they wanted to fund creators doing volumetric video, and so we had the volumetric video match fund, and so now we're going to scale that program up and make it as easy as possible for any company, any DAO, any community, any foundation, any organization to launch a match fund to support the people, projects, and causes that matter most to their community, and that I think will be a really important way for us to reach those types of creators that are outside just the tech art community that we have floating around Artisan right now. And so we're actively trying to find sponsors and partners that are leaders in these different creative disciplines. So that's what's going to come over the next 6 months is I'm spending most of my time bringing on new partners. And it's a good deal for them because it's a way of having their money go further.
Sure.
Because whatever money they put in, our community matches. So if they want to deploy $100,000 towards funding the creators in their community, that'll turn into $200,000 worth of impact for the creators in their community. So it's a good deal for us. It's a good deal for them. And I'm excited to roll that out.
Awesome. And yeah, what does a sponsorship or a creative partner look like in that respect? Is it just a financial backing that helps, as you said, drive impact, or are there some other benefits as well?
Yeah, you get standard sponsor stuff like your logo and a link to your product, company, whatever, throughout Artisan. So whenever a project qualifies for a match fund, our sponsor's logo will show up on their project page as one of the sponsors supporting their project with match funding. So you get like brand awareness stuff. But the heart of our sponsorship deal and really the heart of our business model is this concept of allowing companies who already have capital earmarked to do things like a grant program or earmarked for like marketing to raise awareness for their product to the types of creators like Adobe, for instance. Their whole software is built for helping creators. And we're talking with them to launch a match fund that would support creators building with Adobe. They already have a lot of money allocated to do that activity. And our pitch is just that this is a more efficient and effective way to spend that money. You could spend it on ads, you could spend it on a hackathon, you could spend it on traditional developer grants. And those are all fine and good. But the cool thing about Artisan is that it does two things. One is it allows the community to also chip in money, different sponsors, as well as individuals through purchasing artifacts, allows so a greater amount of money to go towards the types of projects that anchor sponsor cares about. So it's cool for that reason. And then it's cool for the other reason, which is that as we discovered ourselves 4 years ago, doing curation is wicked hard. And having visibility as a big company into what types of projects and what types of creators do does your community that's around your company, what do they care about? What are they excited about? What do they think is of value and worthwhile funding? And Artisan allows that company or that organization to tap that collective wisdom, and we think make much higher quality decisions about which creators and which projects get that funding. So that's the main value that we bring. And of course, the value we get is, and that our creators get, is more
Sure.
capital to go make projects that hopefully have a positive impact in the world.
Yeah. Love it. René, where can potential artists and creators and potential partners, how does one find Artisan? How can they get involved? Where are you guys located?
Yeah, so our home on the internet is artizen.fund. That is ARTIZEN.FUND. So our name is Artisan, like someone who is a craftsperson mashed up with citizen. So it's a portmanteau of those two words collided together, and then .fund, because that's the verb that we do. We fund
Yes.
things. So artisan.fund. And you go to that website, and if you want to sponsor a match fund, if you want to submit a project, if you want to vote for projects, if you want to buy an artifact, like it's all pretty darn obvious. And all the help stuff directs people to me. So if you want to get in touch, like click on anything that says contact us, and it'll probably get funneled to me at one form or another. We're a very small organization, and I very much hope to keep it that way.
Right on. René, I appreciate the time. This has been a very informative chat. I really enjoyed learning more about you and Artisan and the path and the ethos that inspired you to come up with the company and the mission behind it. And yeah, just really good stuff.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you taking the time, man. Anybody that can shine a spotlight on the creators in our community, I owe a debt of gratitude to. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lights, Camera, Crypto, a podcast produced by Matt Bogart and Decential Media. Music by Brian Duncan and Kareem Imes. If you enjoyed this experience, be sure to rate and subscribe to our show and to follow @Sladden and @Decential Media for additional content.